My name's Alan Moore. I write comics.
Alan Moore was born on November 18, 1953, in Northampton, where he has remained all his life. Moore is a famous British comic book writer, and even if you haven't heard of him, it's almost certain you've enjoyed some aspect of popular culture that has been influenced by him. His works have been produced into many feature-length films, including Constantine, From Hell, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, V for Vendetta, and most recently The Watchmen. His work has also been featured on TV, with episodes from the Batman series, and on a more light-hearted note, the child's cartoon series Crypto the Superdog. Moore was introduced to comics at a young age, where, as he explains, comics were just a part of life in Britain.
The working classes, British comics were just something that you had, like rickets. and so it was kind of automatic. And it was pretty much the same kind of lives that me and my friends were actually enduring, you know, so to read about them wasn't that exotic.
So what was the stuff you saw that was different?
In the market stores in Northampton, I can remember that there was one place that used to specialise in these very bright four-colour DC and Marvel superhero comics. These would have been back in 1960 when this kind of big superhero boom was just kicking off.
Not only were comics a part of his life as a child, they became his life calling from an early age.
When I was actually, I think, 7, I decided what I wanted to do with my life, which was to actually put on a costume and fight crime.
Right.
And, well, it's obvious, but what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
You know? And I got my mum to make me a costume. Well, it wasn't really a costume, it was a kind of a vest, and I wore Wellingtons because that was the nearest I could get to the sort of superhero boots, and I got a mask on, and I remember hiding in a tree. And I don't know what I was doing, I don't know what I was thinking.
Was that your special power?
I jumped down, I could hide in trees at will.
Yeah.
And I remember sort of jumping down and surprising, well, frightening my school friends, and they knew who I was instantly. They said, "Why are you doing this, Alan? Why are you dressed like this?" And that was a revelation. Because, I mean, all Clark Kent had to do was to just kind of mess his hair up a little bit and take the glasses off. And nobody even noticed that him and Superman were the only people in Metropolis with blue hair.
Yeah. Well, a lot of your subsequent work has been characterised by a desire to kind of expose the limitations of the superhero genre, and it sounds like you were doing that from a very early age.
That was, I realised the limitations of the superhero genre from an early age, put it like that.
This experience would come to define most of Moore's work, where he would become famous for exploring his idea of the superhero in the real world. However, it wasn't until Moore was faced with a terrific ultimatum that he began to write comics.
Come around about the age of 25, I was married and we'd got our first child on the way. And I'd always had a vague idea that it would be nice at some point in the future to actually make my living out of doing something that I enjoyed rather than something that I despised.
Yeah.
Which was like everything other than comics, you know. And so I figured that, you know, my wife was pregnant. If I didn't give up the job and make a stab at some kind of artistic career before the baby was born, then I know the limits of my courage, and I wouldn't have been up for doing it after I'd got these big imploring eyes staring up at me, you know. So I quit and I did practically nothing for a year. Well, I was convinced I was doing something. I was starting all of these gigantic space operas that I was going to sort of sell to 2000 AD. I was going to write them and draw them. And like, I think about 6 months later, I'd got one page, half penciled, some inks, and I just thought, why am I doing this? And actually, I realised it was because I was never going to finish it.
Right. You'd set yourself an impossible task,
so
therefore
that
you
I'd
weren't
never
going
have to be judged.
Yeah.
At that point, I decided to get serious. And a friend of mine, Steve Moore, no relation, who'd been working in comics since he was 16, told me how to actually lay out a script.
Right.
And I started submitting stuff to the British comic scene, and it all went on from there.
During that time, Moore wrote several stories, including 2000 AD, an acclaimed British comic book, Marvel Men, V for Vendetta, and dipped into the American mainstream with the DC Comics brand and the saga of the Swamp Thing. This excursion into the American mainstream and DC Comics would lead him to writing perhaps his most well-known and critically acclaimed graphic novel, and dive into the idea of testing the limitations of the superhero.
I suppose you got allowed to play with the original characters for DC that you'd created for Watchmen, which is, to this day, something of a phenomena in the comic book industry. It had your name banded around, the smiley face of the covers of Watchmen tied in with the kind of acid house movement as well. It was very much a pop cultural phenomenon. What was the sort of premise of Watchmen then?
It was extending the premise of a previous work of mine, Marvel Man.
Right.
That was a reinvention of a 1950s character who had always been a very innocent, naive American superhero knockoff. But it was putting a character like that into a real, or at least more realistic, world. And that seemed interesting.
Yeah.
It was like I was saying earlier about the motivation for superheroes and how difficult that is. Because there aren't really any sensible motivations for dressing as a bat and fighting. I mean, like, you know, your parents get killed in front of your eyes. That's tough, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, no one's saying that that isn't difficult and it wouldn't be traumatic. But a bat.
I like the classic. There's a classic image from a very early Batman comic where, confronted with the death of his parents, Bruce Wayne says, "Now I will dress as a bat." I mean, that's not come out in 20th century psychology as a standard response.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I did a parody of it in one of my recent comics where I have the main character's parents gunned down in front of his eyes. And he says, "My parents have been gunned down in front of my eyes. I will become a mumbling, traumatized street person and scare everybody."
Moore consistently talks about the creation of the Batman series as an example of the fakeness of the comic book genre as a whole. Moore looked at the comic books as an opportunity to experiment with the superhero. As he explains, the superhero in the real world could be much more interesting than the all-American one-dimensional character that had been revered in past generations.
And I started to think about the idea of the superhero. I mean, if these characters actually existed in real life, it would be a complete nightmare. Actually, you could put a superhero in the real world for a dramatic effect, because they are kind of stupid superheroes. They've got the tight costumes, the stupid names, they're kind of unbelievable. So if you actually put them in the real world and had people reacting to them the way that people would, you'd laugh at them, you'd be a bit scared of them, you know. Then it struck that that might be a different way of looking at them. So that was what went mostly into Watchmen.
Moore's work is credited with the creation of the term graphic novel, only further confirming what most readers of his material had already concluded. Alan Moore had revolutionized the comic, an American literary style, with his portrayal of the superhero in the real world. As far as his literary style goes, Moore draws from all aspects of life in his work, and as he explains, the spiritual world and occult have also had a part in his writing.
There are numerous influences upon my writing. The Romantics, Blake, Fuseli, the Decadents, Beardsley, Wilde, the great magical thinkers, John Dee, Austin Osman Spare, Angels, Demons, Hallucinations.
In addition, The Watchmen was placed in the top 100 books to read before you die by Time magazine, and Moore was parodied in an episode of The Simpsons, one of his favorite shows, paying homage to the writer in the form of bulging muscles and a six-pack. Moore is one of the top, if not the best, graphic novelists to date, and his work has influenced entire generations of pop culture and is still very much relevant today. He has brought praise and respect to the realm of the comic book and has changed the genre as a whole, with characters like Rorschach, who show the dark side of what superheroes can become in real life.